Welcome to Kiera School. Thanks for coming this evening for hopefully informative, interesting, lovely. Don't know what other description words I could use, but thanks for coming, and I'd like to introduce to you artist Francis O'Neill. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I've got to try and do the thing, so you might have to give me a...
Okay, I'll give you a nod.
Yeah.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
All right. I've not done this talk before. I've gone through this with anyone. So if you do have any questions, you can just wave at me and we can ask them. I don't mind being interrupted, and hopefully can make it a bit more sort of informal or conversational, right? But I'm going to go through a few things and hopefully it will be interesting for you. But do interrupt if you feel like there's something that's not clear, if I'm, not speaking loud enough or something. Like, just wave at me. All right. I just wanted to first start with a little bit of an introduction about how I came, because we're going to talk about the trajectory of how I came from doing paintings and being like an art student and getting to the point where I'm researching about Rembrandt and how he might have used lenses for his work and his paintings. I initially just went from school to do a foundation course because probably I didn't really know what else to do, and I ended up doing the foundation course over 2 years and then going on to university, and some of this work that Tom's nudging through here. Just to give you a little idea of the sort of work that I was doing and how that I came to sort of have an understanding, or how I was obviously at the time looking at old masters, doing chalk drawings and trying to get my skill level to a sort of a level that I felt was comparable. Like if you're going to do something, I had this idea that you have to do it well because you want to make money, you just don't want to fall off a cliff like a lemming at the end of your university days and then be working somewhere you don't want to be working. So I spent a lot of time in the life room, and I spent a lot of time using models that were available at the colleges I was at, and a few landscapes and stuff. So I got sort of fairly familiar with the materials that I was using and different ways of making the work. So my training then lasted about 5 years, and then I went away for a bit, and as people do, they got a round the world ticket or they doing odd jobs and things. And when I came back, someone had videoed from the television a documentary by David Hockney, which was called Secret Knowledge. And Secret Knowledge is a film. You can still watch it on YouTube. It's in 2 parts on there. It's about an hour and a half long. And in it, David Hockney comes up with a theory. He looked at old masters' work, and he decided that some of the drawings looked very traced, like an Andy Warhol tracings that he'd seen in the 60s. And he decided that was, but some of them seemed a bit too good to be true, and he started to look into it, and he found that they could have, in some periods, been using optical devices called camera lucida, and the artist in question that sparked him off on this quest was called Jean Ingres. Okay, he's a French portrait artist. There's paintings of his in the National Gallery in London, and his pencil drawings are very, very small, very, very immaculate, amazing drawings, and very, very beautiful and sensitive little drawings. But also the drapery in them is very fluid drawings. So David Hockney looked at that, and and this guy videoed for me. I watched this video, and I've been training, like as you can see the things behind me, I've been training really hard to try and get good at it. And I thought, these guys are just cheating, or they're just using optical devices. The skill level isn't the same. Now, my opinion is sort of mellowed on that score, as I will show you later. But that was my first awakening to the possibility of the use of lenses in old master paintings. And Hockney did this research with a physicist called Falco, a guy called Charles Falco from the University of Arizona. And I presumed, at the time, Hockney excused people like Rembrandt. There was 2 people he excused from using the lenses with their work. One of them was Rembrandt, and one of them was Leonardo da Vinci. And I had no reason to doubt these guys. Like Charles Falco was a physicist, Hockney's this big deal artist. But at the same time, when you look at a Rembrandt painting, for example, all the features in the painting that give you, that Hockney was claiming showed evidence of the use of optical technology were in Rembrandt's self-portraits. And what Hockney had said was that Rembrandt couldn't have used lenses for the self-portraits. But I looked at him and thought, well, they've got all the other features that you justify your theory on. So how could he have been doing that? Was that just a choice? Was it a stylistic choice? Didn't really get that. That didn't really make sense to me. And at the time, I thought there must be a way of bouncing the light around so that you can see yourself. But I hadn't played about with lenses and mirrors. I hadn't a clue. And these guys were physicists and artists who'd put lots of time into it, written books about it, made TV documentaries about it. So I presume they were smarter than me, and they would have sorted it out if that was the thing. And I left it like that. So I thought I'll carry on doing what I'm doing, because that's the way the best guys did it. That's the way Rembrandt did it. They all did it by eye. So I carried on in that vein, all right? So some years passed and that, and I'm investigating some of these paintings that you see behind me. Like this one is from very early on, like a foundation course. They're all done in a certain way with the way people work with paint now, which is they buy oil in tubes and then they use turpentine with them, things like that. I wasn't getting the same effects. That I could actually see physically the paint wasn't moving in the same way as you could see in old masters. It just didn't look the same. You put one of mine looked drier, theirs looked luminous and sparkly, and there was thicknesses and sort of consistency to the paint that you couldn't get. And so I started researching that, and I found a few things out, and I ended up corresponding with a chap in California over the internet. And eventually one day he talked about projections. We were talking about different things, and he emailed me and he said that you could see projections on aluminium foil without being in a completely dark room. And it was that point and straight away that I knew that if that was possible, my little idea of bouncing light around could be possible if you didn't need to be in a completely dark room. Because the whole problem with doing a self-portrait with David Hockney's optical projections is that you had to be in the light and the dark at the same time. So if the artist is painting something, the subject has to be in a bright light and the artist has to be in the dark. If he's painting a self-portrait, he can't be the subject and the object, he can't be in the light and the dark at the same time. So as soon as I knew that you didn't have to be in complete darkness with aluminium foil, I had this little eureka moment. I thought, well, maybe it's possible. So he told me about you can project onto metal and be visible. So I started to project onto aluminium foil with just two little, with a concave mirror, a little lady's compact mirror that I split in half. One was a flat mirror, one was concave, and I was able to project myself onto that, and that's what happened. So at the time, I was chasing the BBC because I'd made a program, or I'd sent them an idea for a program, and I probably shouldn't say this if we're going to put it on the internet, so I'll just skip what happened with them. But I was in discussions with them and with the BBC, and I'd got in touch with them for some reason, and they said, have you got any more ideas? So I gave them 3 ideas, and one of these was this Rembrandt idea that he could have done his self-portraits with projections. And we went through their selection process, and we got past their selection process, and then they ditched it without any explanation. So at that point I was thinking, what am I going to do with it? Because they'd asked me to do work and come up with ideas, so I'd put a little bit of research into this, bit of time into it. And I was speaking to a girl I know called Sophia, who's a physicist, and she said, why don't you stop wasting time trying to get through like selection processes for radio and TV and stuff, and just write it and we can do a physics paper. And she said, I'll translate it into, because physics paper to me is like, why don't you write in Arabic or something? I hadn't a clue. So she said, why don't you write a physics paper? So I said, well, I can give you the information. She says, well, I'll translate it for you and put it into their format. And I didn't realise, because actually what we did in the end was not in gobbledygook. It was fairly legible. It's quite, for the layman, you can read it. It's like but it did need to be put into a format. And Sophia did an amazing job translating my ramblings, basically, into a coherent and presentable paper. So that's the way it went, and then and that's how we ended up doing the paper that I'll introduce you in a second. So so this is the start of the research now. So I've got little chapters for you. That's my first chapter. That's the intro about how we get in for a little bit of biography, and then we're not doing this one. We're doing the other one, Tom, which is, hang on, careful. There's research, I think it's called. No, that's the same one.
Sorry.
Yes, now go back to the beginning of those. Don't look. Don't look. This is the first time, so you're getting it fresh. The first time we've done this talk, this is my cue up here now. So when we've gone from doing my degree and everything, I've ended up in a studio, and I'm working, and I've done lots of other things. We've worked here at Chandera, and we did. I've done paintings from my sketches. I've done lots of sittings with people. I've done. So I'm getting more experience as a painter. I'm sort of moving on a little bit. And then I thought I'd try a self-portrait again, because I probably couldn't think of anything better to do that day, But I did a self-portrait, and what was apparent to me was that I couldn't transfer the level of what I felt, the level of skill that I had I'm doing a bit of teaching and stuff like that, and I could demonstrate things. I couldn't transfer that skill to the same level to the self-portraiture with the same ease, because when you're drawing something that's in front of you, in general, like if it's a still life or a person, or like you have a model in or something like that, you can move. They keep still, you move, you can do what you want. When you paint a self-portrait, you've got to lock your feet in position, you've got to work out where can you have the easel, where can you have the mirror, and you've got to make sure that you can see both and flick your eyes. And every time you move, if the distance between the painting and the mirror is too great, you're moving your whole head. And that becomes difficult. And you've also then got to, every time you look at the mirror, move your head just enough so that you're seeing the same distance beyond your nose, or you're showing the same amount of both sides of the face. It's really tricky. It's a physical discipline. So it wasn't in relation to the skill level. It becomes a real physical difficulty. So I'm probably bloody-minded or stupid or persistent or something, but I tried, and this was the best effort that I got out of locking my feet in, having the mirror and the thing really close together. But it was arduous. It's hard work. It's much harder work than painting other things. If we want to, so I had a few goes at this. This was one that was before the last one, and we flicked through. So then we come to the research. It was around this time that Lewis told me about the metal, and I'd gone on a trip to the National Gallery as well around this time. I just popped in or something, and I was speaking to some people, and we're looking at the old paintings of Rembrandt. And I noticed one of the self-portraits I did, the first one of this little body self-portraits that I did, was that mine was very sharp-edged, because it had to be, because I had to lock myself in position. I had to know that the nose was going to end just there, the cheekbone was going to end just there, because otherwise, if I didn't lock the drawing down, it was wobbly and I wouldn't know what I was doing. So when I went to look at Rembrandt's, his were really fuzzy and kind of ethereal and out of focus. I was like him. So there was only two answers for me. One of them was, he was a genius and saw the whole world differently, or what he was seeing was different. So either he's different or what he's seeing is different. So this is where we came. So we can just flick through these pictures now and have a look. So these, this is my studio, by the way, and then this is the doorway between a slightly darker corridor. So like a maniac, I was in the doorway playing about with my little mirrors and trying to create. And one of the reasons that box was there was because I had aluminium foil at the back of it, so the box was shielding was screening the actual projection surface whilst I played about with mirrors like this in this kind of way. So these are just little mirrors from the chemist. So that's basically, if I stand here, the light would hit my face, then it would hit the far mirror, and then it would hit the near mirror, and then it would hit you've seen the white wall of the box there, but I would have a board with aluminium foil. So these were my formative experiments with it. And I was able to see myself. And the lighting in my studio is not particularly conducive to doing this, because it's a skylight, so that's why I was in the doorway. Hovering about, but if we moved them along somewhere. So this is another thing I discovered. If you put a lens on top of a flat mirror, it operates the same way as a concave mirror. And then I tried various things. I was trying to work out these are. I'm not a physicist, so these are my diagrams. If we keep moving these along, like these. Yeah, just whiz through these, Tom, like 5 seconds each or something. And I'll stop you if we need. So these are just diagrams. So this one we'll stop at. We've got. I went through the book and books and images on the screen, and physicists like this, and I thought this is the most unscientific part of our paper, is that I measured, because obviously all the paintings are different sizes. I measured for the late self-portraits by Rembrandt are very big. They're at least life size and quite impressive and imposing. So I wanted to see if there was a consistency of size. So I measured the images. I got images which had the full canvas on, looked at the ratio, the dimensions of the canvas, and calculated what the real life. Because obviously the galleries are not going to let me have a look at the actual paintings with my tape measure. So I calculated as best I could an approximation of how big the faces were, and they seemed to be around 20 centimeters, 21 centimeters. So there was a consistency of size there. There was, in his later ones. In the ones I used, I didn't even use all of them, but the physicists put that in the paper really. So there obviously are gaps in that. This one, one of the winters when I started to research for, Sophia had said she would do the paper. What you see there is a canvas, and on the left-hand side you can just make out the edge of the mirror. And I blacked out. I'm in a basement flat, and I put blankets all over the window, and I've got a little mirror there, and I used a bike light just to. just to see if in principle, I didn't know it worked yet, in principle, whether if I shine a light from this sort of position, whether I could bounce it and it come out at the same size on the canvas. And so I spent days moving easels around, but eventually I could show that the light ended up on the canvas. And you can see the filament, the circle of the backlight and the filament in the middle. When that was in focus, I knew you could get a focused image that you could reach, close enough to reach if you're holding the backlight or whatever you could. So that's when I knew in principle it worked. And the paintings have not come out as well, because you keep moving through these very quickly. I think you're going backwards, are you? Yeah, the other way. There we go. So I ended up at the Oxford printmakers and projecting onto copper. This is just the Oxford printmakers, just to show us a few things. And they lent me some copper pieces, keep going. And ended up with systems that worked, and these were my diagrams of the systems that worked. And I wanted to put these in the actual physics paper, but Sophia did some really nice ones with graphics. And this is the piece of copper, my image reflector. So what you're actually seeing here is a very difficult image to explain, but if you imagine you are me, so you're in the viewer's position, the top part of the image is a reflection in a mirror. So you're looking at your reflection there, and this is a projection. The projection is nearer to you than the mirror, so you can draw on top of that, and it comes out upside down. So these were my first images, and I'm doing this, yeah? You've all got that one? Yeah, all the projections tend to come out upside down for the systems that I've created. Hockney's, basically, what happens is, if in a camera obscura, if you've got a dark room and a light room, lens goes in the middle, and the lens will always project upside down and reversed back left to right. And you can put a flat mirror and bounce it, which will correct the left to right reversal, but it always stays upside down, unless you do it at an angle. So the light will come through the lens, and you put your mirror like that, and you can change it, and then you've got it on a flat surface, but you can change you can change your situation in relation to the tracing. Okay. Okay, I think we're nearly done. There's a few little, these are just a little collection of images, the best. I'm taking, what I'm doing here as well is I'm holding one mirror and I'm taking pictures, so it's a bit complicated to try and get the other. So you've got a fourth article in the way, because you've got to get the lights, because if you put the light there, you can't see, if you put your camera in front of your face, you can't see your face. So you've got to get all your angles right. So these were not the greatest of pictures of the system. And this is me trying something slightly different with the bigger mirrors. Just whiz through these, Tom, just like, yeah. Yeah, so you get a sense of what I'm doing. Keep going. Keep going. And this is basically, that was good, one of the system there. So you can, if you've got mirrors on stands, you can see how that would work. You just sit at a position, and there's a copper plate. Now the copper plate in these pictures hasn't got a ground on which you would put on for etching, but it works with the grounds. It works with all kinds of grounds, and Rembrandt supposedly used a soft ground, which is the one it works best on. And if you look, I'm in a basement flat which doesn't get direct light, so it's a really poor quality of light that we're operating in here. So if you've got a really good light source, which I have got hold of now, I've got a room where I've been able to work, someone's kind of lent me a room, and I've been able to video much higher quality of projections. I was using copper rather than canvas because the light source is poor, so I wanted to see it clearly. So, yeah. But again, it's establishing the principle. If the etchings could have been done this way and look like they were done this way, there's every likelihood that the paintings were done this way. It's not a cast iron, but that's the way my thought process is working at the time. Okay, just whiz through these to give you a sense of what my flat was like at the time. Keep going. And this one was me establishing the principle that you could do life size. You can't really see it, but that's my face upside down life size. It doesn't come out very well. It actually came out better on the canvas, which I've not got a photo of, and we'll just move through that. And there's Rembrandt, and this is a painting I used to look at quite a lot because I was at a university in Edinburgh, at the College of Art there, and you can wander in there to the National Gallery of Scotland and look at him at eye level. And to me, at the time, this is before I knew anything about the projections, I used to look at this painting and think, why is he not looking at me? I don't know if it looks that way to you, or whether it's the power of suggestion and I'm going to hypnotize you into thinking that way. But when I was looking at it, before I knew anything about projections, I didn't think he was looking straight out of the picture. I thought he was looking slightly this way. And these are more recent ones. These are my first goes in the better light, which I've now got videos which are up on YouTube, which you can have a look at, which are labelled Rembrandt Self-portrait projection, and you can see them working really well. These are just a few little experiments. and they come out upside down. This is an old dirty copper plate that I was using at the time just to test things out. We'll just whiz through these, Tom, and then we'll go on to the paper one. That's one on this one is actually, that's a piece of copper with a ground on it that is much darker than the ground and much less reflective than the ground Rembrandt would have used. And these images are less impressive than the ones when you see the video of them when they're really clear. We'll just spin through that again. And that's on canvas. That's a small one. That's probably about a third of life size on canvas. That gives you a sense of it in inches. That one's not. That one's on a very poor light day and gives you just a sense of scale. But we've got some better ones again on video. This is just my little experiments. Yeah, get a sense of that. So if the light is poor, if you're using small, poor quality mirrors, you get a weaker image. But as I say, on video we've got strong ones. So these were my outtakes, if you like. Okay, and we'll move on to the paper. So this is the crux of it, really. So that's like that's how I got there, and then I'm going to walk you through the paper a little bit, just talk you through what that paper explained. Yeah, here he is. So there are people who've gone through this work before me. And Hockney is one of them, with Charles Falco. There's another chap called Philip Stedman who did some work in 1988 on Vermeer, which was on the BBC, and he put together a program and reconstructed Rembrandt's studio. It was actually a bedroom in Vermeer's studio, and it was in Vermeer's mother's house. That Vermeer had a room that he used, and they made a camera obscura. First of all, Stedman made a small scale model. Then Stedman, with the BBC, he made I think it was a life size or pretty close to life size model. And Hockney's book and Vermeer's book, on two separate subjects but related subjects, came out in 2000, 2001. So about the same time. And in their books, they both include a series of quotes and extracts from literature which demonstrate that people knew about optics and lenses from the mid-1500s onwards, and that's kind of indisputable. There were books and there's literature aimed at artists explaining how to use lenses and optics. It does go back earlier to some degree. You've got Leonardo da Vinci talks about, he has an awareness of the camera obscura, and we only have a third of Leonardo da Vinci's notes. So you've got him talking about the camera obscura, you have him talking about projections, you have him with diagrams and drawings of how to shape concave mirrors. And it goes, and the use of concave mirrors, they were known as burning mirrors, and they go back very far. So there's like a legend of Archimedes burning the approaching, I think it's the Phoenician fleet, with large concave mirrors, and they redirected the sun's rays to burn the ships. So people had known about concave mirrors and certainly about their burning properties and the way they focus light. So there is some background to this, and then you get the likes of Vermeer and Rembrandt appearing at a time when concave mirrors and mirrors of different description and lenses and glassware becomes readily available in Amsterdam and in Holland, and all the places where there was glass-making centres had some kind of painting connection. Nuremberg and Venice is a particularly good example. And there's a suggestion from people like Michelangelo. There's quotes attributed to Michelangelo where he's dismissive of the Venetians' ability to draw, and there's quotes from Italians dismissing the Flemish painting style because it was mimicry, it's imitation. And they didn't know how to draw. Well, we look at those old Venetian paintings and those old Flemish paintings and we think they draw amazing. They've got amazing abilities, but maybe there was something else going on. Again, it's not, it's just suggestive of a different, why were they saying that they couldn't draw? Maybe they knew the way they were making the paintings. I mean, we'll leave that question open. Also, in relation to this, Rembrandt's students Van Hoogstraten and Karel Fabritius were known to, I'm not quite there with these, I'm a bit slow on this, but were known to have seen camera obscuras used lenses, Van Hoogstraten. If you go to the National Gallery, there's one of these optical devices where you put your face and you can look and you can see a room. It's like a perspective trick box. So these guys were not only aware of lenses, it's documented that they saw them, and I think it's Van Hoogstraten who wrote a book after Rembrandt had died about the uses of lenses and everything. And there's Karel Fabritius who paints a picture which appears to me to have been done using a fisheye mirror or lens, because it shows him looking around a corner, the way you'd use the fisheye mirror to do your reversing when you're coming out of a difficult driveway. It's got that kind of viewpoint in it. Okay, taking into the paper now, so if we go back one, if you can, Tom, we've got, these are about Rembrandt's work in particular. I've used Rembrandt as like the vehicle to demonstrate the fact that all masters could have used these techniques. So this one here is the first point that we make in the paper, is that initially, when Rembrandt is young, so I think he's about 20 in this picture, it's roughly like 19, 20, 21. And I always think of this as him laughing because he's found out how to use the thing. I think there's some kind, the psychology of this picture is that he's happy about something. But I mean, even disregarding that, what we're looking at in terms of what we can observe and we can say as a fact is these are done on a very small scale. They're done on copper. There's 2 or 3 paintings on copper, and this is one of them. And another thing about this would be the expression, which would be very difficult to hold for a long time. And it's quite muted in terms of the palette, which suggests it's done quickly, and the area of sort of central area of focus would probably be the face and the gorget there or whatever. But yeah, it's the scale really, and the fact that he's painting on copper. Like I asked my question, why is he painting on copper? So if we go to the next one, this is Rembrandt with his wife Saskia, and initially, if we go to the next one after this, Tom, this is a better image of it actually. So initially, if you see the circle there, I thought this was a central area of focus, and I'm probably wrong about that in retrospect, but the reason I put that circle around it is to draw attention to the fact that there seems to be really strong drawing and observational quality in the head and obviously his wife as well, his self-portrait head and his wife. But then he's totally out of proportion and the hand seems a bit weak, right? That's what I observe in it. Now, actually, if you're using projections to make an image like this, and there are more than one image version of this, so in this one it's him and his wife, and it's him and someone else in another, and there's him with nobody, you would have to do the head and the background head separately. You'd have to do the self-portrait separate from the head because you have to refocus. So, but certainly, even if we disregard Saskia for a moment, there's something weird going on in the relationship of the head and the hand for someone who can draw the rest of it that well, in my opinion. So we just notice the next one. So these are we're talking about the facial expressions here as well, like how hard would that be to hold, even the sort of angle on his neck. Whereas actually to see yourself at that angle, or actually to create that face, you have, with the projection, there's certain angles of your head that you have to do, and this is one of them. Like if you wanted to look down at it, your head would end up at that sort of angle.
How are you suggesting that he did this then? Are you suggesting that he just captured one look?
No, I'm suggesting that the difference between, what we're exploring here is the difference between going from, as I was saying earlier, if I am painting or tracing myself from a flat mirror, the flat mirror has to be somewhere, and I have to look back and forth from one to the other, even up or down, so my head moves, okay? But with a projection, what happens is the light would go from your face to the flat mirror, which you can have small ones like this, set up something like this, and then back to the concave mirror, and then to the thing. So you're always only looking at the copper etching plate. You don't have to move, so you can pull all the faces you want, and you're not moving. So you're tracing and not moving. That's my suggestion. So if the etching plate like this one is very, very small, it's like about 5 centimeters squared, something like this, you can actually put the flat mirror behind it or below it, probably maybe above it to the side, and the light can hit you and hit the concave mirror and come back, and it can look almost like you're looking at yourself because it's so close to the flat mirror. Yeah, so you were there? Okay. So because he doesn't have to move his head, basically, that's the key thing, because he's always looking at the copper plate at the projection. He's not moving back and forth to another visual image. He's always looking at he's tracing himself on there. That's what we contend, right? So we'll have a look at the next one. I go again. Yeah, so it gives you an idea. It's quite small, but anyway, keep going. Yeah, so then as he gets better, he tries more ambitious things. But again, the head sizes remain quite small. And there's a limit to how big you can do the head, really. And what I found is that you get a sharper focus the smaller the image is. So if you're doing it on copper, it goes a bit diffuse and blurry. And if you've got a stylus or a needle point, and you're scratching into your ground, you don't want to blurry things particularly. Although if we can go back, Tom, we can just have a look. It is quite blurry still underneath his next one. I think there is a kind of blur to his cheekbone, to his jawline, sorry, and on the right hand side here and around there. It's not really that distinct where the hat and the hair merge. Okay, so there's certain little features like that which are characteristic of, but again, not watertight, but characteristic of the use of projections. And we'll move it along again. So this one quite an interesting one to look at while we're here, because in this one you can see on the book there's a kind of a shadow near his pen. Yeah, can you see that?
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll just, whilst we're on this image, I suggested, this one caused me a lot of difficulty looking at this, but how could he have used my system if he's drawing flat on a horizontal surface? So he couldn't have, if that's an accurate representation. But his head again looks too big for his shoulder on our left hand side, on the viewer's left, on the right hand side. And then I didn't know about that elbow. I hadn't spotted it. But the scholars have looked at that, and in the notes of the British Museum, they report that they think that's his original drawing of his elbow, which makes sense, because in order for me to set myself up doing that with my system, you have to be reaching across this way, and that's where your elbow would end up. So I didn't know that and I was thinking that's the only way he could have done it. So I think he's conning us here, that he's drawing horizontally. I think that's the point of it. I think that's the point of the image, is to make you think that he's drawing on a horizontal surface, so that he couldn't possibly be doing it. So he's actually using deceit, in my opinion, in this one, to show that. And then in the later stages of the same etching, he widens the elbow, and the shadow on the book becomes less visible. Okay, so he corrects the drawing where he's made it too narrow, because that was the part that he'd invented. All right, we'll whiz along a little bit. Different versions of it. Yeah. Okay, and these are also small scale ones here. And actually, I think this is the first one of. A second point for the paper was that we think that his eyes don't ever quite look straight out. So we just go through a few examples of this. We'll go to the next one. See, that's quite clear to me that he's not looking straight out at you. He's not looking at his. When you draw yourself in a reflection, you have to look directly at your eyes, or he's looking straight back at you, and then you go back to paint. Now, obviously, he's working on a small scale, and he could be making mistakes, or he could not quite get the needle where he wants it. But he's pretty good at getting the needle where he wants it on lots of other things. But the eyes are clearly, to me, on this one, looking not directly out at the viewer. So I've obviously put this paper out there, and people just say, well, he's doing that by choice, and if you want to believe that, that's okay. But there was a medical team looked at Rembrandt's pictures, and someone had obviously clocked this. So it was not. I thought for a long time this might be my confirmation bias. I'm looking for Rembrandt using an etching system, a projection system, and so I find evidence of it. But then I found 10 years ago or something, there was a medical team had noticed that his eyes were looking out of the canvas at an oblique angle, or out of the etchings, and they studied it and found it occurred in a really high proportion, something like, I think, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like 47 of 50 or something like this. And they thought he had what they called a strabismus, which is basically a lazy eye, a wonky eye. Because they couldn't, I think they only found that one of his eyes wandered. But I think that's because they knew that he would not have been able to see himself unless he had one eye looking at you, looking straight out of the system. But if we have a look at a couple more examples of this eye movement, I think he's looking downwards there. I think he's looking below the mirror. I think he's looking to his left, our right of the mirror there. He's looking to his left, our right of the mirror there. And the last one is the best one, I think. I think you can see one of the best ones. if we go back to that one, sorry, this one here. This one is a sheet of studies, so this is much older. A lot of the other ones, a lot of the etchings he did when he was quite young, and then he sort of seems to be a bit of a fallow period or less prolific period with etching. So this one is a fairly late etching, I think, and you can see to me that he's looking downwards. He's not looking straight at you on this one. And it's also interesting that the next guy was a guy called Castiglione, I think, and he manages to crack doing these amazing self-portraits on copper on a small scale, having seen Rembrandt do it, sort of. So, okay, just like you do. So anyway, next one, let's have a look. Chiaroscuro, it's like Italian words for, for the high contrast of light and dark. So there's always a high, and actually not only is the high contrast of light and dark, this one as well, if you ever go to the National Gallery, this might not be the best image of it, although I think this is from their site. There we go. I think he's not looking at himself there, I think he's looking just fractionally. Obviously you put your painting and your mirror as close as you can together, but to me his eyes seem to be looking. I've had people tell me that this isn't a strong point with the mirrors. But the way I look at it is that if you're looking for evidence of a system being used, then you look into you've got to look for visual image of it. We don't have he hasn't written down for us that I used this projection system. So I'm looking for the paintings. You would expect, if the projection system was being used, you'd expect to see it in the paintings, and these are the little anomalies that you would see. And with paint it's possible to correct it, but to a certain degree. But if your drawing is set or placed in a certain way, it can provide an influence on the subsequent painting, and I think that influence is seen in some of the self-portraits. Although people argue that you can do it any way you want to, and he could have just chosen to paint himself looking laterally and obliquely out of the image. And the medics found that he was looking to like something like 30 degrees, as far as 30 degrees obliquely out of the image in a lot of the images that he painted of himself. So we'll have the next one. And that's another one which I've told you about already, where I think he looks obliquely out of the image. This one, yeah, I mean, all of these are examples of chiaroscuro. You can see in the paintings, there's always bright light on his face, which is a requirement of our system. You have to be well lit. The room has to be dark so that you're getting a projection. A bit like this, we've got a projection up for you here. The room has to be relatively dark, and our lights have to be pointing in such a way as they're not making the projection less visible. So he has to be in bright light to be seen. There's a possibility on this, I don't want to stretch this point too far, but those pupils the irises, sorry, they look wide to me. They look kind of a bit doe-eyed once you're looking for these things, particularly the one on the right. And if you imagine the process through which I'm assuming that he worked, is that he would paint himself and his eyes would have to be looking at his canvas, and the lens recording him is to the side of his canvas. So when he'll paint an initial lay-in, whether it's, I don't know how far, that he would get as far as it was useful for him to use the projection. And then he could correct that without the projection. And so the corrections could lend themselves to things like the eyes being slightly wider if you wanted to make it look slightly more like you were looking straight out of the canvas. But I mean, again, it's not essential evidence. It's just an idea I've got about that one. The iris, and again, it could be an accident, and it could be by choice that his eyes the far one looks quite wide. Okay, we'll do the next image. Okay. Yeah, so all of these are examples of chiaroscuro. The physical discipline, I think the last one as well. If we go back to the last one, sorry, because they're all evidence for different points, you see, so they overlap all the time. But this painting, if we're talking about the virtuosity of his painting, so we looked at the one of him laughing on the copper, and so obviously to paint yourself laughing, whether you're projecting or not, there's a certain virtuosity. You have to work at speed, don't you? If you're painting yourself with a laughing, smiling expression, you'd have to be quick. You'd have to be good at it, because it's only so long, even with the greatest physical discipline, that you could hold a smile or with your head cocked back and that sort of thing, or the one on copper where he has his open mouth and pursed lips. So there's a virtuosity to his mark making, okay? And in this one there is as well. And in addition to this one, there are areas of the painting where the ground shows through and just become part of the part of the painting, unnoticed almost. So his first marks were sometimes his last. He hasn't built it up in all the places really heavily. And the quality of the way he's used the paint in this one, when you see it close up, is incredible for the accuracy of the marks. There's actually a quote about this that I would like to share with you, which is from a guy called Professor van der Wettering, who is from the Rembrandt Research Program, and he writes books about Rembrandt. And he says this: skills developed through intensive practice lead to spontaneously executed movements that are very similar to reflex movements, which is true. What strikes me so much about Rembrandt each time, for example, is the extraordinary concentration with which he must have worked. This spontaneous hand is a self-evident and integral part of his artistic skill, a skill that is now scarcely imaginable. But he explains it for different reasons. He says the delightful combination of uninhibitedness and appropriateness seem to be dictated by the force with which that image is kept alive in the artist's imagination. And this is the key thing. Only great purity in the experience of the world to be represented in a work make it possible to be what you make rather than manufacture it. This, I believe, is the only way to explain how the artist acquires this remarkable uninhibitedness which causes the spectator to feel that the work could only be this and not otherwise. So basically, it's quite a flowery language, but he's saying that only great purity in the experience of the world would allow you to achieve virtuosity of painting. And I'm saying, well, maybe he was just painting onto a template. And one of them seems to me more prosaic and more credible. Than he's basically saying it's otherworldly, and I don't know. Art historians find ways to explain what they want to explain, but I think maybe we should be looking at something a bit more practical, rather than saying that he was on a different world. Although then the argument would be that some people are just great musicians and they just appear, and at 12 years old, the virtuoso Mozart and people like this, or Stevie Wonder, whoever you want. Okay, we'll move on from that. These may be useful because we can have a look at the hands in them. A lot of the paintings. Obviously, if you're painting hands, you can't. And doing a self-portrait, it's very difficult because you maybe hold a palette, you've got your brushes, and it's going to be a bit tricky, isn't it? So he does his hands collapsed a lot, like that. In this one is the one where he has both paintings, the hands visible, and it is possible to do this with a concave mirror. You'd either need a big one, and I've actually got hold of a bigger concave mirror where you are able to see that, except it's not quite the specifications that I want, but I was able to see like my whole head and face and hands. It was just a bit too blurry for what I would want to paint from it, because it's not quite the right focal length on it. But I think there is a way to do it that way. And you could paint your right hand in that position with your left hand on the thing, and you could paint it that way. It would be tricky whichever way, whether you were using a projection or whether you were doing it just from a flat mirror. But I think that the hand that is detailed is in bright light, and the one that's not so detailed is in dark light, which is again something that we'd get with projection systems. You don't get very clear images in the shadows. So it's just an interesting little point. Something is going on there anyway for him to be able to paint his hands. And as we saw, he wasn't really able to do it that well in the etching, wasn't it, to describe his hand that well in that one. Let's have a look at the next image. Yeah, this is more like my setup when I'm doing self-portraits. I've got the canvas very close to me because you don't want to flick your eyes that much. And then we'll have a look at the next one. I think it's going to be Van Gogh again. There he is. So again, you can see the canvas eating into the space because you have to have it so close. On the Rembrandt, the canvas is nowhere near. That's him showing you what he sees in the mirror, and you can see how the canvas has to encroach on the space because he has to keep his eyes really close because he doesn't want to move his head. You don't see that in the Rembrandts. The next one. Oh, this is an interesting little image because this is from Rembrandt's studio, and what you're seeing here is light coming. He's got the window over there, but the bottom shutters are shut. So you're in the position of the artist. So I've been to Rembrandt's house, and there's no light behind you. There's no window behind you. So you're painting against the darkness in a dimly lit thing, but why would you be doing that? Whereas actually that would be perfect for projection, because then the light would come from the window or from that side of the room, and you could, the light from the window would not be on your projection surface. Okay, next one. Oh yeah, this is the eye directions again. So this is Hans Baldung, we're just going to have a look at these. So my eye direction point is made about Rembrandt, and you can argue that away all you want, but then we're going to have a look at these. So all the old masters make the choice of not looking at themselves when they're doing self-portraits. Here we go. Here we go. Leonardo da Vinci, next one. Central area of focus, at width of which there is much less detail and it becomes much more stylized. Next one. Titian, still not looking at himself. Next one. Titian. Veronese. Veronese. I mean, those last two may have been the other ways around them. I didn't put them in the paper because you could say that's a massive piece of work, and he could have used assistants and things like that. And his assistants could actually have traced his image for him, and he could have painted it up or whatever. But on the ones where it seems like there is only one individual making the painting, they were clearly playing about with mirrors. Here, you can see that, and optical effects. Artemisia Gentileschi, you know, if she painted that without the use of optics, she's very clever. She's certainly, and you have to think about this in terms of if what I'm saying, if my projection system is not correct, if the idea is not correct, then what you've got here is a lady painting with 2 flat mirrors at least, and when you use 2 flat mirrors, you have the distance. So we can use 1 mirror. If I'm a meter from the mirror, my image appears a meter in the imaginary virtual space. Yeah. So if you use 2 mirrors, whatever distance is between the mirrors is doubled. So she becomes smaller and harder to see. But maybe she used 2 flat mirrors. Next one. That's a tricky one to figure out, him and his mate. But they obviously had scientific equipment going on. Again, if you're using 2 flat mirrors, the image you see becomes very small, and it becomes difficult to do, because in order for him to see what he's showing us, he has to have a mirror in front of him and a mirror there. So where is he putting his canvas? It becomes a very complicated system. This one I really like. Right, this one, because I've spoken to this chap, Philip Stedman, who's been very courteous and engaged with me. And Philip Stedman was the Vermeer man who showed that Vermeer was using a camera obscura. And this is Dürer as a young man. And he writes on this image that at a later date, this I made when I was it's different, people say different things, 12, 13, 14. I think he says he's 14, but he might have been younger. And he says that he did it using a mirror. And Philip Stedman didn't like my theory because although he believes in camera obscuras and artists use camera obscuras and projections, he says that in the literary record there is no proof of the use of concave mirrors for paintings. Okay, so I said, well, there's a literary record on this image because he's written I did this with 1 mirror, and it would be very hard for himself to see himself looking in that direction, or even from that angle with just 1 mirror. And he's written on it that I did it with a mirror. He doesn't say with 2 mirrors or 3 mirrors. And I wondered whether he could have just done it with 1 concave mirror at this position and projected it onto his drawing surface like that. But Mr. Stedman didn't like that. He told me that Dürer was a genius, and he could rotate it in his mind, and he can imagine himself. He could look to the mirror and maneuvered it and manipulated it with his mind and his genius and put it onto the paper. But that isn't what he's written on the drawing. And it's also curious that the next image, oh no, he's not there. His dad does one. We'll find it. There's his dad. Which is exactly the same angle and setup, if you like. So they both chose to draw themselves from an angle which is really difficult to see yourself using a flat mirror. Okay. And if we go back to the last one, the one before that, you've got again the chiaroscuro, and he's not quite looking at himself, or on the bigger image it doesn't quite show. And then we'll go through a couple of these. There might be a few more of these eye directions. The use of a curved mirror there to make a painting quite clearly. This is the Karel Fabritius, who was a student of Rembrandt, with his fisheye lens. It seems to me to be a fisheye lens. It might not be, maybe you could do that. But there seems an awkward curve in it, if not. Okay. I'll have a look at the next one. This is Rubens. What you find with a lot of the self-portraits is they spend a lot of time looking over their nose at a really sharp angle, whereas it's much. This is with my system when I'm setting up and playing around with it. You see, when I've got the better images, this is it's very hard to get them straight on. It's much easier to do them like this, where you're looking over your nose. Okay, we'll have another come. So this is Rubens. That's Van Dyck looking over his nose. There's Velazquez looking over his nose. Van Dyck again. Next one. Sorry, Van Dyck was the figure looking over his nose. I presume you figured that one out. Yeah, there we go. So the last one was Rubens, that's Van Dyck, there we go. Okay, and then those are just to give you an idea of, and this one he's clearly looking off to your left and viewer's right, if you can see his eyes in the shadow there. Might be a bit hazy on the projection, okay. This one's quite an interesting one because I was going through the book of Rembrandt Self-portraits, and I didn't know about this one, and it was in the book when I was going through this, like I don't know how many Rembrandt self-portraits, and it's not exactly cast iron how many self-portraits Rembrandt actually did, because there's copies and emulators and students and things like this and people forging things. So in the book there's lots of them which we know are attributed to Rembrandt, where his eyes don't seem to be looking at himself. And this one, in the book, in the information underneath, it tells you that this one they think is not by him because he's not looking at himself. And yet that would, to my mind, eliminate a number of them from the Rembrandt oeuvre. But they say because he's not looking at himself, they don't think this is him. Which that makes me think it's more likely to be him. Or by him, sorry. That's the next one. And that's him not looking at himself as well. That's in Melbourne. And the other one was in Vienna. But again, I think they've proved this is him, even though they didn't think it was initially, because they've tested the canvas. But there he is, not looking at himself anyway. Okay, he's looking out to the other side this time. Okay. And I should also say, to give the opposite argument, so people will say, you know, that what I'm saying is not accurate, that you have, this is Rubens, and Rubens was a bit like a Hollywood motion picture director. He was doing all sorts and amazing things, like a size scale, battle scenes. I think this is an important distinction we could throw in here. Today we have people who can draw by eye, so we know they exist. We also have people who can draw from their imagination, and they can invent characters and animation characters and cartoons and illustrators, and they can draw things from their imagination and conjure up a scene. So we know they exist. We also know that people nowadays use projections, whether it's from laptops or overhead projectors. We know they do that as well, and people copy and trace things. This one here is Rubens, but there's no way, obviously, he painted himself like that. That's him with his wife, and so some other forces involved there, whether it's his imagination, an assistant, or some technology that we're not privy to. So the opposite argument would say Rubens could do that, so he can draw himself any way he wants to. But as with a film director or you can get assistants to hold the camera, and you can get people to control the image in different ways, I would have thought. So, it isn't cut and dried. Obviously I'm giving one side of the talk here, one side of the story. But there's Rubens anyway. Tom's distracted. Right. But I thought I'd put that one in there because I've shown you a selected sample of people looking across their noses, and he's also painting himself like that, where he's much more straight on. So we don't quite know how that was made. Okay, we'll look at the next one. Oh yeah, this is another one. This is Velazquez looking across himself, I think. All right. Again, very sharply. All right, let's have another point then. This one's about, I think it's a virtuosity of the paint as well. And you've got a few points in this one. Chiaroscuro. I've just lost my thread a bit with my notes here, but let's have a look at the next image for a cue. Yeah, it's the similarity of lighting, I guess, we're talking about here. That one very young and one very old, and there's a similarity of lighting and position throughout. I mean, he does play about with lighting when he's younger, but there is a degree of consistency both to the lighting effects, the strength of lighting, the shadows, and the position of his head in his paintings. It's not, cast iron. There are some variations early on, but he seems to settle into a pattern where the lighting's coming from one side of his face, and he tends to look across himself a little bit like that. Okay.
One eye's looking sort of dead actually, and the other looking really there. They're not.
That's what the medics found, isn't it, with the strabismus? That's what they said. But I wonder whether part of that is because, as I say, if you lay in the image in a certain way with your eyes going one way, and then and it's upside down at that stage, and you lay in and you get your broad proportions and you get everything, all the information you need, and you flip it back up the right way and you start to work from the mirror, and you think, oh, I need to make it look a bit more, you might get that kind of sort of disturbance in the visual image. But I wouldn't hang my argument on that. But that would be a practical outcome of using the system. It would be a conceivable outcome of using the system. Okay, and you've got his hands there, clasped together. And another thing to look at here is maybe we're talking here about the projected image and how it tends to be fairly a circular area of focus. So if you're making a projection using lenses or concave mirrors, there'll be a central area of focus that is particularly sharp and informative, and the rest of it will be slightly blurry. Okay, we'll just whiz through, have a look at the next one. And that central area of focus is, again, this is Leonardo da Vinci. It's what's called in art history as the first autonomous landscape drawing, because it doesn't have any religious overtones. And to my mind, when I look at that, you've got the very sharp distinction of the castle and the landscape, but as you get onto the right-hand side, viewer's right-hand side of the image, you can see it starts to go a bit wonky and a bit blurry, and the trees start to getting up to a bit of LSD action over here. Yeah? And the art historians say that is Da Vinci straining against the limitations of representational drawing. I say that was exactly what you would see and how you might record a projection. Shall we have a look at the next one? There again, you've got the central area of focus, and it's blurry lower down, and also, it's and this one actually, we can have a look at, because in images like this, Rembrandt is looking in the mirror. So if you imagine if you're right-handed and you look at that and pretend that's your mirror reflection, he has his palette in his right hand. Is that right? So we know that he's deviated from the reality of what he's seeing with the hands, at least. And there's another painting in which that happens in Paris with Rembrandt and, at the easel. So he changed the hands, and we've seen that from X-rays, that he's changed the hands about so that he appears right-handed to the viewer in the painting. Okay, so we know that he corrected things, but we also know that the initial lay-in was dictated to by that reality. So that's I think an interesting point for the projection idea, that he didn't just, if he could make it up, why didn't he just make it up from the start? He had to put it down one way because he was using a projected image, I think. Okay. And there's the one at the easel again. He's shown himself right-handed, and the X-ray shows that he's changed the hands around. Okay. These are his students. This is Philip de Judeville, who's, and you find that if you're standing in the projection system, to get yourself to see yourself like that, you inevitably adopt this strange position to like change. You can look at it quite naturally. The canvas will be here, and your projecting mirror will be there. And if you want to make it a bit more straight, you end up with this kind of weird contortion of pose. And I think he's not very good at connecting the head to a sort of made-up body, which he might have put on a model or a mannequin. Okay, so but also it just shows you that what Rembrandt's students were getting up to. I don't think he's achieved the combination, because I think they were using the projection in combination with real life, or maybe putting clothes on mannequins or something like that to do the bodies, because sometimes you've got complicated clothing. and I don't think he's connected the two very well. It looks like he's got no shoulders, and there's something strange going on with the angle of his head. We'll have a look at another one. That's the same guy, Philippe de Jodeville, and that's him showing himself laughing. Again, I think there's something a bit weird about it. And he has to turn back towards the light. It's something that you'll find if you use the system, that in order to show yourself that way, you end up with this weird angle to your head and your shoulders. Okay? These are early ones where he's playing about with the lighting, and these are on a smaller scale. But what these highlight for us is that when you make a projection, or even if you're using an overhead projection or a movie projection at home, the brighter images show up better, and the shaded images you lose a bit of detail. And I think that's what is shown here. Yeah, and the next one as well. You've got a lot of detail in the light, and you can't see anything, whereas human eyes don't work that way. We look into the shadow and we adjust and we can see detail. I can see your eyes now, and you're in quite darkness, but he loses a lot of detail in the same way as a projection would. Okay, next one. This is the virtuoso paint I was showing you before. There are some little gaps of grey within there. You can see he's just whacked it down, and it seems like around his mouth and just under his bottom lip there's patches of grey, and just under the cheekbone. You can't really notice them. Maybe also underneath that swiper paint at the bottom of his nose, there's a few bits of gaps, which is just the grey of the canvas showing through. And maybe just on the sort of wrinkle under his eye, there's a few gaps there. So some of his first marks or his last, he's just slapped that down, and he hasn't had to go through all that rigmarole, or he doesn't appear from what we see there to have had that difficulty I found of the physical discipline of having to keep your head still. He's just really confident and knows what he's doing straight away, almost like he's painting onto a template. Next one. This is Karel Fabritius, who achieves a similar, or a comparable, I would say, skill. He's one of his students, and again the lighting is very similar to the Rembrandt paintings, and he's got the wide pupils, wide irises, that kind of thing. And that's, funnily enough, Karel's brother, Barent, was pretty good at self-portraiture as well. And he didn't, he may have been a pupil, but we're not sure. And also he's got the same lighting, and he's looking down at himself in what would be a curious, difficult place to go. Yeah. Next one, we're going to have a quick look at, and we threw these into the paper at the end. No matter which way you look at it, Rembrandt was a great painter, because there is some reason why it's different, and art historians will tell you that's because he made a stylistic decision not to paint that way. But this was also a massive painting and a big deal commission, and it was going to be seen from far away, so that could affect the way you painted it, because you might treat it differently because the viewing distance is different. But there's a little part of me, and again, this is not proof of anything, it's a little part of me thinks that maybe he didn't have either the studio or the money, because he'd lost his house by this stage, and he had a purpose-built sort of outhouse or shed extension put on to do the Night Watch, which is the painting before. And with this one, he was selling his wife's grave, and I wonder whether he had the space to do it privately, to use his techniques, or whether, if it was painted in situ, whether he was able to use his techniques there, or whether he could pay for models, and so that he ends up making it up and it looks different. I think there's never just one reason. They just said, because he wanted to. That's the reason they give for everything. He's a genius, godlike person who just does everything because that's his choice. So we threw in a few questions about that one into the paper. All right. And then there's another photograph of this which I've seen in books, but I've not been able to find to present to you. But if we look at the drawing of it, these create a little bit of curiosity in me. So if we can just draw your mind back to the ones where he's doing himself with pursed lips and funny expressions and things like that, they couldn't have been held very long. It's particularly the etching of him with the sort of matron sort of face, with his pursed lips. So this guy could, and there's pictures of him, there's drawings of him, really rapid drawings that he's done of people working and things like chopping up carcasses. And then this is of a sculpture which sits still. And there's not the same, you don't see the same level of accuracy in it. And I know he doesn't have to always draw the same way, but given that he can, with really quick poses and shortly held expressions, he's not doing. Then the next one's, this is a painting that he saw, and we know that he saw this in an auction house, and this is the drawing that he made of it. We can flick back again to the painting. It doesn't really even look like it. For someone who's got that level of skill, like it, I'm not saying that he has to every time, but in the ones, these are the only examples I can show you of things that we know what they are and what he drew of them. And they don't demonstrate, and he would have done this in the auction house apparently, so. And there's that one again. And this one is a painting that there is something funny going on in here, because this is apparently a self-portrait. It's called An Artist in a Studio, but if we think of it as a self-portrait, it becomes difficult to understand, because it's a very, very small board, and so he's not painting on the board that we see in front of us, and he can't paint from that distance, and yet and the face is very weak in this one, and actually somebody else has painted in black eyes to make the eyes more visible. Later date, they put two little dots in there. So that angle that you saw there in the painting is an angle that would be conducive to projecting with the light on the left hand side, because because the angle that we're seeing, if you actually think about being the painter in that picture, the light source is to the left of you, and your canvas has to be against the light source, so you've not got light on your canvas, so it would be a good place to put your reflecting mirror or your projection device. You can't, if you think about where you have to be to paint that picture and see that scene, you either have to imagine it, or you're in your own light, you're in your own darkness. Okay. No, I don't think you have. I think it's easy. Oh, he's the man's here. Here we go. Does anyone have any questions at this point? I mean, I was going to wrap it up there pretty soon anyway. We're pretty much through the paper there, and go on. Yeah.
The exhibition in the National Gallery a couple of years ago.
Oh yeah, it was about a year, isn't it? It's about a year, is that right?
Just a year ago.
Okay. Yeah.
Huge exhibition.
Yeah, I was there. Yeah, I went to that.
Many which haven't been seen for a long, long time.
Yeah. We went. I went round the galleries when I was I did my foundation course and my degree. Yeah, I was just going to show you this one. I mean, it's like you can see on this one. It's this is an imagined one. Obviously, he's not got someone to have their eyes stabbed out and stuff. But there's anomalies occur in the ones that are imagined, like the man's weird little armoured arm there, that you can see that just don't appear in his self-portraits. I mean, obviously there's a difference in the scale and there's a difference in the approach and so on. But there are things in there that you'd think a guy with that level of observational skill would think, can't put that arm in, it looks a bit funny and short, just make it a bit wider, cover a bit of Samson's leg there. Wouldn't have cost him anything. I mean, it's a great painting all the same, but there are certain anomalies in it. Yeah. And this is the quick diagrams of my system, which you've seen on the pictures in the flat. You can see how it works, more or less like that. These are ones Sophia did from my biro drawings. Okay. That's another one which we think Dürer could have used. I mean, not necessarily could have used, but because he says he did it with a mirror, that, you know, something along those lines. And this is a way of varying. This is for the copper etch, the smaller scale ones. So the ones with just the head would be the one on the left, and if you want to make the body see more of the body, you push the flat mirror back, and it gives you a slightly smaller image. Okay. And those are the diagrams. I just whiz through these, Tom. Yeah. It's actually quite. That's a template showing that they understood all this stuff. Johannes Keplar, this is a kind of record of his findings, that you can do various projections, and it's the sun on one side and the projection on the other. showing that with different lenses you can get it upright. He was clever enough to do an upright image with camera obscura, but not life size. It would be smaller, I think. Okay, and that's how we ended up, I think. And a couple more maybe. There's a few more that I've thrown in here. Me looking cross, doing it for somebody. I thought you might like that. Yeah, you all got that? Okay, we'll move on. And we'll just move on. I think there's just a couple of little things. This is one that's very similar. It's not exactly the same one you've seen before. One of them is in Nuremberg, one is in the Maritz house. And a feature of them is that they are both drawn from... No, they both have no underdrawing. And actually, this was considered to be the Rembrandt because it's finer, it's more smooth and stuff, and polished and more finished. But they found out that this one has underdrawing, that they can, I think it might be in charcoal, but it certainly has an underdrawing of a type that they can X-ray and see. And the other one doesn't, and so they now know that's the Rembrandt because none of his paintings have underdrawing or evidence of linear underdrawing because he did like tonal blotches. And this is another thing that we find in Vermeer, who we think used camera obscura, is that they didn't need drawing to position it, and they didn't need to keep to that linear outline because they were just, in my opinion, painting onto the template given by the projection. So they didn't need that assistance. Okay, it's an interesting little point about that one. Okay. Is that we done? I've got a couple of quotes from me that I was going to just read out very quickly. Giotto is another one, like Dürer, who I was told that concave mirrors are not in the literary record. There's a quote about, I'll read it to you. It is initially perplexing that Villani tells us Giotto painted the double portrait with the help of mirrors in the plural. It seems unlikely that Giotto would have needed more than one mirror to paint a self-portrait. And why would he have needed any mirrors to paint Dante's portrait? One possibility is that Giotto used the mirrors simply to improve the lighting in the same way that scholars place the mirror over their desk. But why would Villani even need to mention this relatively minor detail? So then the writer is called Hall, and he's doing a book about self-portraits, and Hall eventually concludes that Villani's mention of mirrors can be attributed to symbolism or to an elaborate but vague metaphor. Because the self-portrait Giotto did was of himself and Dante, apparently. So Dante is the key, for he had a vast amount to say about mirrors. Dante used mirrors as symbols on 30 occasions in his writings, and Giotto, in Villani's account, has mirrors whilst in the presence of Dante, suggests that he is both Lear and Rachel, active and contemplative, and that his self-portrait is painted as a part of process of self-knowledge and self-love. So this information is given to people, but they choose to interpret it in the way they want to interpret it. You can't do anything about that. You just keep presenting the information. And another couple of things is that, which are quite nice, is that the remark attributed to Michelangelo mentioned earlier, Flemish painting was concerned primarily with external exactness. They paint stuffs and masonry, the green grass of the fields, the shadow of the trees and rivers and bridges, which they call landscapes, and all this, though it pleases some persons, is done without reason or art, without symmetry or proportion, without skillful choice or boldness, and finally, without substance or vision. So that's that dig about them. And Venetian painters could never hope to attain perfection in their art, since according to Vasari, they lacked the means of freeing themselves from their slavish dependence on nature and were forced to conceal under the superficial charm of their colouring their ineptitude at drawing. But we look at the Flemish painters and think, oh yeah, they're quite amazing. Van Gogh said about Rembrandt's painting, one must die several times to paint like that. And you would probably have to die several times to paint like that if you were just doing it as, we would think as conventionally as you were doing it. And he writes that what struck me most on seeing the old Dutch pictures again is that so many of them were painted quickly that these great masters such as Frans Hals, a Rembrandt, a Ruysdael, and so many others dashed off a thing from the first stroke and did not retouch it very much. Hockney said they are painted fast. He said the underlying precision is uncanny. He asked of Velazquez, Pope Innocent X, how did he paint that silk so perfectly, so fast? so these kind of quotes, I mean, there's a couple more here if I don't want to bore you, but I'm just rattling through them. The brush is not working at random, rather it adheres with extraordinary fidelity to the system which the photographic reconstruction of the spatial situation called for. The areas are not determined by linear outlines, but by light and shade juxtaposed in an orderly way. The order is not that of direct vision, it is that prescribed by an image projected through a lens. Yeah, so I mean, that's basically it, isn't it? I mean, there's a couple more, but you get the idea. These people have noticed this stuff and they can't explain it, and so, you know, we've put for an explanation which has not really been accepted by art history at this stage. So there are a number of things like that, and I've had quite a vitriolic response to. But from some people, like the guy I was talking about in California, we were talking about how to make paint, he's ceased to communicate with me because he thinks I'm a charlatan, and after my 15 minutes of fame, whereas I felt I've presented this quite honestly and gone through the information as best I can. And as I say, Philip Steadman, who I thought might be willing to look at this evidence, and which he has been, actually he's been very fair, but he does not see that it, he thinks it's like a conspiracy theory because it cannot be proven because there's no literary record of them using concave mirrors. So I've made the point to that you can look at the paintings and see things in them that are visual evidence, which is a first-hand primary document. The painting is a primary document in itself, which is equivalent to a literary evidence. And so if you look at that, then you can see and that's the way that I used to look at the paint. I used to look at the paint and think, they're using different paint to me, I wonder what's going on. And now they've done chemical analysis of the paint, which shows that the paint is different, and they had egg in it, and they had chalk in it, and they had other additives in the paint that they used that has never been written down. So there is no literary record of the fact that they painted differently. So why would their other techniques be written down? So that would be the case that I would make there. So that's pretty much it, I think, for the Rembrandt. And we were going to talk about a couple other things just to finish. Yeah.